Hello again, Thunder Agakalaria, and today we'll be watching Did the Pagan Goddess Inspire Easter from a Religion for Breakfast channel. Okay, let's go and see. I don't know, I heard about pagan like kind of beginnings of the Christmas, but Easter it's the first thing.
Every spring, around the Christian holiday of Easter, the misinformation starts to flow about the supposed pagan origins of Easter. Some of these memes can be dismissed out of hand as not worth the energy to refute. For example, the idea that Easter is somehow linked to the Near Eastern goddess Ishtar is complete and utter nonsense. A claim so untethered from any evidence, I'm happy to ignore it. But, as is often the case, misinformed claims that have a sliver of truth are the most difficult claims to address, because in order to address that sliver of truth requires synthesizing actual scholarship from half a dozen peer-reviewed articles and books. In this case, the claim is that Easter is actually linked to the ancient pagan goddess Eostre, a goddess supposedly linked to fertility, a goddess whose symbols were supposedly bunnies and eggs, and who was celebrated during a festival in the spring that was co-opted by Christians. A goddess whose iconography often depicts her as a blonde-haired being, ushering in the spring. So is any of this true? Let's start with the kernel of truth. The English word Easter actually does originate from a pagan goddess. We learned this from the writings of a Christian monk named Bede, often called the Venerable Bede. He lived during the late 600s and early 700s in the Kingdom of Northumbria, an Anglo-Saxon kingdom that spanned what is now northern England and southern Scotland. Of his many writings, he wrote a book called The Reckoning of Time. As the name suggests, it's about measuring time, all in an effort to create a Christian calendar. Specifically, it's an attempt to calculate the original date of Easter, because Christians didn't really know when to mark the death and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels say that Jesus was executed around the major Jewish holiday of Passover, which changes year after year on the Julian solar calendar, because Passover is tied to the first full moon of the first month of the Jewish lunar solar calendar. So Bede and other Christians spent an enormous amount of energy calculating the original date of Easter, and it's a pretty complex book. Bede discusses ancient calendars, the changing of the seasons, and the movement of the sun and moon. Buried in this bewildering book, Bede starts talking about the Anglo-Saxon lunar calendar, approximating the months of this calendar to the Roman Julian calendar. Throughout this comparison, he explains the origins of the names of each month. There is the month of 3 Milkemonath, a month named because the cattle were milked 3 times a day. Then there's Weodmenoth, or the month of weeds. As he goes down the calendar, one of those months may sound familiar. Eostre month has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eostre, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by her name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance. So, according to Bede, there was an Anglo-Saxon goddess named Eostre, who was celebrated during the month that we now call April. Bede says that Christians now call the season commemorating Jesus' death and resurrection by that name. So, what do we know about this goddess? Almost nothing. This is the only time Eostre is mentioned in any ancient source. She appears nowhere else in history, and no archaeological evidence exists for her worship. Nothing except Bede's single paragraph. I'm sorry to belabor the point, but the text you see here on screen is the only historical evidence we have for this goddess. In fact, the evidence is so thin, many scholars over the past century assumed that Bede had no idea what he was talking about, and he may have invented the goddess to try to explain the month's name. In the mid-90s, one scholar even said, Eostre is an etymological fancy on Bede's part. Now, I actually don't think this is the case. As we'll see in the next section, some scholars are moving more toward taking Bede at his word, and assuming he had some accurate knowledge of this god, even if that knowledge was, at best, based on vague and tenuous cultural memory of a pre-Christian past. He seems to imply that these festivals had long since disappeared by his time, and he's not drawing on direct eyewitness accounts. I'm stressing that this is our only evidence, not because I doubt that ancient Anglo-Saxons once worshipped a goddess by this name. I'm stressing this so that you can immediately know that anyone who links the cult of Eostre with specific practices or symbols is either engaging in educated speculation or inventing stuff out of thin air. As we'll see in the next section, linking Eostre with the spring or the dawn is educated speculation, but any connection between Eostre and anything involving Easter eggs or rabbits is baseless speculation. As the historian Eleanor Parker says, eggs were not associated with Easter until the medieval period, and rabbits even later than that. So if we take Bede at his word, there are two firm claims we can make about Eostre. She was called Eostre, and she was celebrated during what's now the month of April, sometime before the 7th and 8th centuries, perhaps much earlier. From these two data points, we can attempt to reconstruct more about this goddess. The philologist Dr. Philip Shaw, a professor of Old English, is perhaps the leading scholar in this niche little corner of medieval Anglo-Saxon religious history. In 2011, he published a book titled Pagan Goddesses in the Germanic World, in which he digs into the research on the goddess Eostre. Because we have no other evidence except for Bede's single paragraph, Shaw needed to study the goddess using other methods. First, by examining her name using the methods of historical linguistics, basically asking, what can we learn by reconstructing what her name means? And secondly, by examining comparative evidence of Germanic goddess cults from mainland Europe. Let's start with the historical linguistics. Shaw argues that the name Eostre derives from the Old English word meaning eastern. He also argues we can possibly see her name in the names of a few places in England. For example, Eastry, a civil parish in Kent in southeastern England, which lies on an ancient Roman road. Though the connection of this region to Eostre is by no means certain, he argues that names like this are evidence for a pre-Christian goddess that corroborates Bede's paragraph. So, assuming that her name is indeed tied to the direction east, and her festival was indeed celebrated in April on the Julian calendar, some have speculated that she may have been associated with the dawn, or the spring equinox. The Indo-European language expert M.L. West argues her name derives from the Proto-Indo-European word for the dawn. And the archaeologist Richard Sermon points out that a festival in April would have regularly started around the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, when the sunrise and nearest full moonrise would have occurred in the most easterly positions on the horizon. I agree that this would not have gone unnoticed by an ancient agrarian culture, and therefore think it's possible that Eostre's festival occurring in April means she was somehow connected to the changing of the seasons or the spring equinox. But this is educated conjecture based on the little evidence that Bede provides. And as we'll see later, while her name does probably mean east or eastern, Philip Shaw thinks there's no reason to connect her to the dawn, but rather connect her to an eastern area or people group. So let's turn now to that comparative Germanic evidence that I mentioned before. Shaw and other academics have tried to learn more about this mysterious goddess by looking at goddess worship in mainland Europe, arguing either that Eostre may have been a pan-Germanic goddess, or more narrowly, she was a local Anglo-Saxon goddess who we can better understand by comparing her to Germanic religious practice. The theory that she was a pan-Germanic goddess was championed by the German folklorist Jacob Grimm way back in the 1800s. In his 1835 study, Teutonic Mythology, he theorized there must have been some sort of Germanic goddess named Ostara, a cognate with the Anglo-Saxon goddess Eostre. He came to this conclusion because he noticed that the Christian festival of Easter was called Osterun in Old High German during the late 8th century. By linking this festival name with Bede's Eostre month, he argued that the German version must be named after a pan-Germanic pagan goddess, a divinity of the radiant dawn, of upspringing light, whose meaning could be easily adapted to the resurrection day of the Christian's God. But no direct evidence for a goddess named Ostara exists. Grimm invented it. Some scholars theorize that the Germans started calling the Christian festival of Easter Osterun because Anglo-Saxon Christian missionaries brought the name. But all this to say, the pan-Germanic goddess theory is based on very thin evidence. Shaw offers an alternative theory in his book, arguing that Eostre was a local goddess worshipped in Kent, and it paralleled local goddess cults on the mainland, for which there is some actual archaeological evidence that we can turn to. In 1958, archaeologists discovered 150 Germanic Roman inscriptions in Germany. They date to around 150 to 250 CE, and almost all of them are dedicated to beings called the Matronae Austriacenae. Now, we don't have any other sources illuminating who these Matronae Austriacenae may have been, but their name may derive from an early Germanic word meaning Eastern. Shaw translates the name as Eastern matrons, or more specifically, the matrons of the Easterners, since the suffix seems to imply a people group. This huge cache of evidence suggests that a large cultic center or temple must have existed here for an otherwise unattested Germanic Roman cult, some sort of local cult that was Romanized over the centuries of Roman rule. There were several matron goddess cults in this region of the Roman Empire, oftentimes simply called matrons of a specific location or people. For example, we have evidence for the matrons of Bergusia, a region in what is now Spain and France. Then there's the matrons of Vesunia, another settlement in what is now France. Shaw argues that these were ancestor cults that existed prior to the Romanization of the area. He goes on to say that these inscriptions offer us a glimpse of pre-Christian religious life that was highly localized and embedded in the society and politics of a relatively narrow geographic area. For example, the matrons of Vesunia are divinities of one small little settlement. He argues any cult of Eostre would have looked the same. She potentially was a highly local goddess, and he suggests that local region was none other than Eastry in Kent. The name itself might mean district of Eostre. If we do indeed see an echo of her name in this area, Shaw argues her connection to the east would have developed because she was the goddess connected to an area or people group identified as Eastern. This idea that she was a local Kentish deity thus does away with the idea that her name is related to the dawn. Shaw admits his theory is based on conjecture as well, but he argues it offers a more plausible and archaeologically informed alternative to the pan-Germanic goddess theory. He goes on to say none of this proves any specific connection between Eostre and Eastry, of course, but this does make a case for the existence in pre-Christian England of relatively small-scale social groupings which, quite possibly, had their own local group-specific goddesses, and Eostre could well be just such a goddess. So that's about all we can say about Eostre. To emphasize how little we know, notice how many qualifiers the top expert in this field adds to his conclusion. Quite possibly, and could well be. Even her name is ambiguous. She may have been linked with the concept of East or Eastern, but even that could have several interpretations. We don't know if Eastern means she was linked to the dawn or the spring or the equinox, or simply to the Eastern people of Kent. But as I said at the start of this video, what we can firmly conclude is that the English name Easter derives from an Anglo-Saxon month named for a pagan goddess, the month within which the Christian festival most often fell, what we now call April. On one hand, this could be interesting. It shows that Christians at least tolerated the name, and it's certainly plausible that local Christian authorities encouraged the Old English name Eostre to help with conversion. In a letter dating to 601 CE, Pope Gregory recommended a strategy of acculturation to help convert Anglo-Saxon pagans to Christianity. He recommended, instead of destroying pagan temples, to convert the buildings into churches, and to co-opt pagan sacrifices as opportunities to celebrate the martyrdom of Christian saints. But this possibility doesn't make the claim Easter has pagan origins any less of a huge overstatement. This may be no more significant than the fact that these Christians also didn't seem to mind using pagan names for the days of the week. The fact that Wednesday comes from Day of Woden, the Old English version of the Norse god Odin, doesn't necessarily mean that Woden worship was an ongoing cultural influence on these Christians. The historian Eleanor Parker thinks the name Easter caught on early and widely across the English church, and quickly lost any pagan associations. Secondly, it's also important to point out that using the name Easter is a very localized phenomenon. I keep saying Anglo-Saxon Christians because we're talking about the English name for Easter. To this day, most of the rest of Christianity derives the name of this festival from the Greek word Pascha, which itself derives from the Hebrew word for Passover. The claim that the Anglo-Saxon goddess Eostre had any significant influence on the Christian holiday Easter takes a very narrow view of Christianity during the late Roman Empire. By the 8th century, when Bede wrote on the Reckoning of Time, Christianity already spanned all of Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, Ethiopia, and all the way out to China and India. So the notion that a festival of an Anglo-Saxon goddess way over Northumbria had any influence on Nestorian Christians on the edges of China is absurd. So where did this idea of the pagan influence on Easter come from? These memes, ironically, can be traced back to a Christian fundamentalist author, the 19th century Scottish minister Alexander Hislop. He was a stridently anti-Catholic activist, and in 1858 published much of his criticisms of the Catholic Church in a book called The Two Babylons. The papal worship proved to be the worship of Nimrod and his wife. The book is full of blatantly biased pseudo-history, as he tries to tie Catholic religious practice to ancient Near Eastern religions. For example, he claims that the worship of Canaanite gods like Baal was transported to Britain by the Druids, and Baal's consort Astarte was changed into the Anglo-Saxon Eostre. He confidently concludes, "Such is the history of Easter. The popular observances that still attend the period of its celebration amply confirm the testimony of history as to its Babylonian character." Basically, Hislop's book is the 19th century version of the pseudo-history memes you see all over TikTok and Twitter each year. Now, this is not to say that Christianity is not influenced by its cultural context. Of course it is. But as I've said on this channel before, ancient history is an empirical discipline. Claims need to be backed up with evidence. And when it comes to the goddess Eostre, the evidence you have is this one paragraph on screen. If you've been watching this channel for a long time, you'll know that I've covered the evolution of religion. How religion is one of those facets of human behavior that shows up time and time again in history as humanity developed a sense of self. Along those lines, I've been watching Becoming Human, a series by Real Science about the evolutionary process that led to humanity. The last episode focused on one of the principal components necessary for the evolution of religion: language. This is a high production value show exclusive to and only made possible because of Nebula, a creator-owned and creator-operated streaming service where you can watch exclusive content ad-free from a whole bunch of educational content creators. This includes me now because I'm very excited to announce I've recently joined Nebula as one of their creators. So by subscribing to Nebula, you can support creators like me and many others. I'm excited because on Nebula, I'm not at the mercy of YouTube's algorithm and rules around ad-friendly content. So for example, check out Real Life Lore's Nebula original series, Modern Conflicts. It's an in-depth geopolitics series exclusively available on Nebula that explores the armed conflicts of the 21st century, a series that might get demonetized on YouTube but thrives on Nebula. This is great for a religious studies content creator like me because it opens up opportunities to explore the full breadth of religion. Nebula also offers classes where you can learn skills from your favorite creators. These are fully produced multi-episode classes where you can learn about stuff like how to sue like a lawyer with Devin Stone of Legal Eagle. If you sign up using my link below, you can get both Nebula and Nebula classes for a 40% discount off of annual plans. And those annual plans are a great deal at just over $2.50 a month. Like I said, because Nebula is creator-owned and operated, by signing up, you're directly supporting me as well. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Cool. Okay. Fun fact. Easter in Polish, it's called Wielkanoc, and literally translates into a big night. Or a large night. Yeah, Wielkanoc. So, it doesn't really go from Pascha. I don't know why. And I think that the name derives from the fact that Jesus came from the dead in night, isn't it? Something like that. Anyway, that was interesting. I thought there would be more about that. There would be something more. This is kind of explains why I never really heard about the pagan goddess that inspired Easter, because there isn't much about it. It's just there's some memes that are coming up. Obviously there are different goddesses in different religions and stuff like that, that they would probably have something to do with the spring and all that. Like the fact that he did included the pieces of footage from the American Gods showing, I think that was it, literally the goddess of spring. And that was really good. Kind of opening my eye about the fact, well, my eyes about religion are already open for a really long time now. That it's a lot of Christian religion is kind of like taken from different religions that they were before, and they were kind of squashed by the Catholicism. But yeah, that was great. And by the way, Eric is doing dinner and it smells absolutely delicious, so I better finish and go. So thank you very much for watching, and I see you tomorrow. Bye!